The Vatican has been one of the most powerful religious centers on earth for centuries. Millions of people know it as the spiritual heart of the Catholic Church. But behind the churches, palaces, museums, and sacred ceremonies lies another story. A story about lost territory, political power, billions in financial assets, real estate, international banking, and one of the most controversial banking scandals of the 20th century. So how did an institution that once controlled a vast territory in central Italy lose almost all of its political power, and then build a sophisticated financial system capable of preserving its independence for generations? The answer begins with a crisis. And surprisingly, that crisis started in 1870. Until the 19th century, the Pope was not only the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. He was also a political ruler. For centuries, the Papal States controlled a large territory across central Italy. The Pope had armies, administrators, tax revenues, palaces, land, and political authority. Rome itself stood at the center of this unusual combination of spiritual and temporal power. But the political world around the Papal States was changing rapidly. Nationalism was spreading across Europe. And in Italy, a powerful movement was attempting to unite the peninsula into a single country. The biggest obstacle was the Papal States. The new Italian state wanted Rome, but Rome was controlled by the Pope. For years, the situation remained unresolved. Then, in September 1870, everything changed. Italian forces entered Rome. On September 20th, troops breached the walls near Porta Pia. The Papal States collapsed. Rome was incorporated into the Kingdom of Italy. The Pope lost his territorial empire. And suddenly, one of the oldest political structures in Europe had been reduced to a tiny area around the Vatican. Pope Pius IX refused to recognize the new political situation. He considered himself a prisoner. The dispute became known as the Roman Question. For decades, the relationship between the Italian government and the Holy See remained deeply hostile. But this was not simply a political problem. It was also an economic problem. The old system had disappeared. The Pope no longer controlled a vast territory. Church properties had been seized or transferred. The political institutions of the Papal States were gone, and the Holy See had to survive in a completely different economic environment. The Vatican could no longer rely on the machinery of a territorial state. It needed another way to remain financially independent. For decades, however, no final solution was found. Then, after the First World War, Italy entered another period of political instability, and eventually, a new man rose to power: Benito Mussolini. Mussolini and the fascist movement wanted to consolidate political authority across Italy. But there was one institution he could not simply ignore: the Catholic Church. Millions of Italians were Catholic. The Church possessed enormous social influence, and a reconciliation between the fascist government and the Holy See could provide political advantages to both sides. For Mussolini, an agreement could strengthen his legitimacy. For the Vatican, it could finally resolve the Roman Question. And perhaps, more importantly, it could provide the Holy See with a secure legal and financial foundation. Negotiations began. They were complicated. They involved territory, religion, property, political authority, and money. After years of negotiations, the breakthrough finally came. February 11th, 1929, at the Lateran Palace in Rome. Representatives of the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy signed what became known as the Lateran Pacts. The agreement fundamentally changed the Vatican's position. Italy recognized the sovereignty of Vatican City. An independent state was created. Its territory was tiny, roughly 40 hectares, but its political significance was enormous. The Roman question had finally been settled. Yet there was another part of the agreement that would become even more important for the future: money. The financial convention accompanying the Lateran Pacts provided the Holy See with 750 million Italian lire in cash. It also received Italian government bonds with a nominal value of 1 billion lire. This was not simply a payment that could be spent without a plan. It represented the financial foundation of the new relationship between Italy and the Holy See, and suddenly, the Vatican had something it desperately needed: capital. But possessing capital and managing capital are two completely different things. And this is where one of the most fascinating figures in the story appears. His name was Bernardino Nogara. Nogara was not a priest. He was an engineer and financier. And that was exactly why Pope Pius XI wanted him involved. The Vatican now needed someone who understood the modern financial world. Someone who understood bonds, markets, gold, real estate, industrial companies, and investment risk. Nogara understood something that many institutions learn only after painful experience. Money that simply sits still does not necessarily preserve wealth. Inflation can destroy purchasing power. Political crises can destroy assets. Currencies can collapse. Governments can default. And economic systems can change. So, Nogara approached Vatican finances with a different philosophy: diversification. Instead of keeping the Vatican's resources concentrated in a narrow group of assets, he looked for ways to spread financial risk. Real estate became important. So did securities. Gold played a role as a store of value. And relationships with financial institutions provided access to international markets. This was a major transformation. The Vatican was no longer simply trying to recover from the loss of the Papal States. It was developing a financial structure capable of supporting an independent institution without a large territorial economy, and this distinction is important. The Vatican was not becoming a normal multinational corporation. Its objective was different. It wanted financial independence. It needed enough economic strength to operate without being completely dependent on another government. And over the following decades, that philosophy helped shape the Vatican's financial system. But there was a contradiction at the heart of this strategy. The Church had traditionally warned against excessive attachment to material wealth. Yet the institution itself needed wealth to preserve its independence. This tension would follow Vatican finances for generations. As the 20th century progressed, the financial structure became more complicated. The Vatican developed relationships with banks and financial institutions across Europe. Its investments expanded, its real estate interests became significant, and its financial institutions became increasingly sophisticated. Eventually, another institution became central to the story: the Institute for the Works of Religion, known by its Italian initials as the IOR, and commonly called the Vatican Bank. The IOR was established in 1942 under Pope Pius XII. Its purpose was not identical to that of an ordinary commercial bank. It was created to manage and administer assets intended for religious and charitable purposes, and to serve institutions connected to the Catholic Church. But over time, the IOR became involved in international financial relationships, and that created opportunities. It also created enormous risks. Because the more complicated a financial network becomes, the harder it can become to monitor every transaction. By the 1970s and early 1980s, the Vatican's financial system became connected to one of the biggest banking scandals in modern Italian history. At the center of the storm was Banco Ambrosiano, and one of its most famous figures was Roberto Calvi. Calvi was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. Because of his relationship with the Vatican, newspapers eventually gave him a dramatic nickname, God's Banker. But behind that nickname was a complicated financial relationship. Banco Ambrosiano had developed an international network involving offshore companies and financial structures. The Vatican Bank had financial ties to the institution, and eventually enormous questions began to emerge. Where had the money gone? How large were the liabilities? Who controlled the offshore companies? And what exactly was the relationship between the bank and the Vatican? The scandal became even darker when investigators and journalists began examining alleged links between Banco Ambrosiano, organized crime, political networks, and a secret P2 Masonic lodge. These allegations became part of one of the most complicated financial investigations in Italian history. But it is important to separate documented events from allegations. Not every claim made during the scandal was proven in court, and the exact role of different individuals and organizations remains a matter of historical debate. What is not disputed is that Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, and the consequences were enormous. The bank's failure exposed massive financial problems. Creditors were left facing enormous losses, investigations intensified, and the Vatican itself came under enormous pressure. Then came the most mysterious event of the entire story. Roberto Calvi disappeared. On June 18, 1982, his body was found beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. At first, his death was treated as suicide, but the case did not end there. Investigations continued. Years later, Italian judicial proceedings treated Calvi's death as a murder. The case became surrounded by allegations involving organized crime, financial interests, and individuals connected to the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. But even after years of investigations, the full story remained extraordinarily difficult to establish. Several defendants were eventually acquitted in proceedings connected to the murder, and Calvi's death remains one of the most controversial mysteries in the history of European finance. For the Vatican, the damage was enormous. The scandal created a crisis of credibility. The institution had to confront a fundamental question. How could a religious organization maintain sophisticated financial operations without allowing those operations to become opaque or vulnerable to abuse? The answer would take decades. The Vatican began introducing stronger financial controls. Oversight mechanisms were expanded, international cooperation increased, and financial transparency became an increasingly important issue. The transformation was gradual, but it changed the nature of Vatican finance. Today, the IOR looks very different from the institution surrounded by the scandals of the 1970s and 1980s. The IOR now operates within a modern, regulatory framework. It publishes annual financial reports, and its financial activities are subject to internal and external controls. The numbers are also fascinating. According to the IOR's 2025 annual report, the institution managed approximately 5.9 billion euros in total client assets at the end of 2025. It reported approximately 2.5 billion euros in total assets. It's 4 million euros. And its non-net assets stood more than 115 million euros. These are significant numbers. But there is an important distinction. The 5.9 billion euros is not the total wealth of the Vatican. It represents client assets managed or held by the IOR. The IOR itself reported approximately 2.5 billion euros in total assets. So when you see sensational claims that the Vatican controls tens or hundreds of billions of dollars, you should be careful. There is no single public balance sheet that combines every asset connected to the Holy See. Vatican institutions, religious orders, dioceses, churches, cultural collections, and Catholic organizations around the world. The financial structure is much more complicated than that. Another important institution is APAS-A, the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. PSA manages significant financial and real estate assets belonging to the Holy See. This means that the Vatican's financial system is not simply one bank account. It is a network of institutions with different responsibilities. And then there is real estate. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. The Vatican and related church institutions have historically held properties in Rome and elsewhere. Some are used for religious purposes. Some are used for administrative purposes. Some generate rental income. Others have historical or cultural importance. But again, sensational numbers should be treated carefully. It is difficult to calculate a single figure representing every property connected to the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church is not one corporation with one global property register. Different dioceses, religious orders, foundations, and institutions own different assets under different legal structures. So the idea of a single secret Vatican property empire controlling every church and building on earth is misleading. The reality is more complicated and in some ways more interesting. Because the Vatican does not need to own everything. It only needs enough financial independence to protect its institutional independence. And this brings us back to the strategy that began after 1929. The goal was not necessarily to become the richest organization on earth. The goal was survival. The Vatican needed a financial system capable of surviving political change. Governments could change, currencies could collapse, wars could destroy economies, markets could crash. But a diversified financial structure could potentially survive all of them. Gold could protect against currency instability. Real estate could provide long-term value. Financial securities could generate returns, and institutional investments could provide income. This was the logic behind the transformation. And it explains why Bernardino Nogara's role remains so important. He helped move the Vatican toward a modern financial mindset. The later scandals showed the dangers of that strategy. But the reforms that followed demonstrated something equally important. The Vatican did not abandon finance. It tried to make finance more controlled, more regulated, and more transparent. The transformation is remarkable when you look at the timeline. In 1870, the Papal States disappeared. The Pope lost his territorial empire. For decades, the Holy See existed in political isolation. Then, in 1929, the Lateran Pacts created Vatican City and established a new financial relationship with Italy. The Vatican gained capital. Nogara helped develop an investment strategy. Over the following decades, the financial system expanded. Then came Banco Ambrosiano, then Calvi, then scandal, then reform. And today, the Vatican operates a financial system that is significantly more transparent than it was during the darkest years of the 20th century. But one question still remains. Why does a religious institution need so much money? The answer is not as simple as greed. The Catholic Church operates thousands of institutions around the world. It maintains churches, hospitals, schools, charitable organizations, religious communities, diplomatic operations, museums, archives, and humanitarian programs. All of these require resources. Financial independence can also protect an institution from political pressure. If an organization depends entirely on another government for its survival, that government gains leverage. The Vatican learned this lesson in 1870. The loss of the Papal States showed that political power could disappear. The financial strategy that followed was, in many ways, an attempt to make sure that economic independence would not disappear with it. And perhaps that is the real story. Not a secret conspiracy. Not a mysterious vault filled with unlimited money. But a centuries-old institution adapting to a world where power increasingly depends on capital. The Vatican lost its territory. So it built financial independence. It lost political power. So it strengthened institutional sovereignty. It experienced financial scandals. So it introduced reforms. And it survived. That may be the most remarkable part of the entire story. The Vatican's financial history is not a straight line from poverty to unimaginable wealth. It is a story of adaptation, political compromise, investment, risk, scandal, failure, and reform. And it raises a fascinating question about the relationship between faith and money. Can a religious institution remain faithful to its spiritual mission while operating sophisticated financial institutions? Does financial independence protect the Church from political influence? Or does the pursuit of financial power create a contradiction with the values the Church teaches? There may be no simple answer, but one thing is clear. Behind the walls of Vatican City is not just a religious story. It is also a financial history. A history that stretches from the fall of the Papal States to Mussolini, to the Lateran Pacts, to Bernardino Nogara, to the Vatican Bank, to Banco Ambrosiano, to the mysterious death of Roberto Calvi, and finally to the modern financial system that exists today. The Vatican did not simply survive the collapse of its old political world, it adapted to a new one. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden inside this extraordinary story. When political power disappears, financial independence can become a form of survival. So what do you think? Was the Vatican's transformation into a financially sophisticated institution a contradiction of its spiritual mission? Or was it simply the strategy necessary for one of the world's oldest institutions to survive? Let me know your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoy financial history, forgotten scandals, powerful institutions, and the stories behind the world's most mysterious fortunes, subscribe to Echoes of Finance and turn on notifications. Because sometimes, the most fascinating financial empires are not the ones everyone knows about. See you in the next documentary.